Future.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Fitzgerald H. Bendel-Smith, and today we continue our lecture on the post-Napoleon era and the ever-expanding world of the Association of Ishtar. In part 1, we discussed the aftermath of the French occupation and about the elite's desire to create a new status quo through the Vienna Convention. How the goals of the technocratic elite conflicted with the rise of various ideologies among the general populace and the growing awareness about anomalies called rifts. Today we'll discuss how the powers became aware of these portals to other worlds and how it led to the creation of RA. But first, a thanks to all our sponsors who help us create the original art for this video, our supporters on REAM. Support us on REAM today and gain access to our short stories and all published ebooks. Now on with the lecture. We left off with the discovery of a weapon cache in Spain left by the French army during the Peninsula War and how these were used to destroy a never before seen life form. By 1814, it was no secret that Napoleon was working on special weapons programs, but how his administration managed to create such a complex machine like the R2 rockets that he fired at England remained a mystery for decades to come. One of his most notorious scientists, Ghulam Ali, had been developing rockets long before he came into the Emperor's service. However, the leap from elaborate firework displays to developing the R2, let alone putting it in mass production within half a decade, astonished the scientific and industrial elite alike. This led to wild speculation on their technological expertise. Some took such progress for granted, while others suspected otherworldly influences or ancient records that may have been recovered from Egypt. You have to understand that Napoleon's archaeological efforts really changed how people perceived the Middle East and the ancient world. The Africa and Persian kingdoms in particular were only known by anecdotes by Greek writers, who most likely never even been there themselves. This inflamed the imaginations of the literary crowd, conjuring up tales of lost civilizations and even subterranean worlds that might have been in contact with Elysium up in the sky. Of course, it was a bit odd the Greek philosophers never mentioned the bell-shaped object. Regardless, this was the 19th century. Everything was possible. Back in reality, however, there was a growing desire to investigate these rift anomalies and regulate whatever should be allowed to come through. Obviously, there was a concern for public safety, but also the threat to the balance of power. If the reverse engineering of potentially more advanced technologies was allowed to go untested, this could destroy Metternich's precious concert system and embolden empires to expand unchecked, leading to a potential forever war. That is why it was decided that the public should be kept in the dark until proper agreements could have been reached. Regulation became a buzzword bounced around between diplomats, but in reality, what each party really wanted to know was how many rifts the other side had already discovered. Government agents started to seek out these anomalies actively, for safety concerns of course, and there was the matter of French scientists who were still missing. However, for some reason, these special investigators kept having unfortunate accidents. It was agreed somebody would conduct these investigations, lest they'd allow one group to gain the technological advantage. In view of mutual distrust between the empires, there was a need for a neutral party who could also be held accountable. The head of the Federal Chancellery of Austria, Minister Metternich, reached out to his friend, Hendrik Lazare, an ambitious diplomat from the Swiss canton of Zurich. Why would an Austrian foreign minister appoint a foreign diplomat? For that, we need to talk a bit about Switzerland. Since gaining independence from the Holy Roman Empire in 1315, or 1684 depending on how you look at it, the Swiss had made its custom to stay out of everyone's business, and things were good. Mostly. During the revolutionary era, they got trampled by the French early on in 1798. The French needed access through various mountain passes between Paris and Milan to connect northern Italy, which was conquered by a by then little known general named Napoleon Bonaparte. The occupation of Switzerland wouldn't last, but the French introduced very important changes to the Swiss constitution, such as individual rights and equality before the law. However, the supporters of the French reforms and their opposition quickly fractured, and by 1803 Switzerland was plunged into a civil war, resulting in famines that would last for years after the empire had already been defeated. In 1814, the Congress of Vienna was uncertain what to do with the Swiss cantons, whose desire to be independent made them a wild card to Metternich's new world order. Lazare, however, reminded Metternich that the Swiss Federation had rarely chosen any side during the great conflicts, and it just so happened that what Europe needed was an arbiter, somebody who'd remain an observer, a neutral party that would not intervene in any conflict. The Swiss were mostly isolationists who wanted to be left alone. They had no overseas territories, dynastic rulers, or foreign alliances. Ergo, Switzerland was the neutral party that the coalition was looking for, a mediator who could aid in negotiations as objective participants, theoretically at least. Thus the Congress of Vienna's final act stated, "By the present act make a formal and authentic acknowledgement of the perpetual neutrality of Switzerland, and their guarantee to her the integrity and inviolability of her territory within new boundaries, in true interest of the policies of all Europe." To give this statement credibility, this treaty was signed by the most powerful men in Europe at the time, such as Wellington, Richelieu, and of course, Metternich himself. And so in 1823, the Recovery Committee was created, and where to better establish this organization than Switzerland with Lazare as its chairman. To Lazare, this was the ideal case to prove the world the Swiss were ready to be the neutral arbiters that the world needed, starting by cataloging rift locations and reverse engineered technologies. So called because it assumed to be technology inspired by artifacts of unknown origin. However, the origins of these hypothetical archaeotech eluded everyone. Thus the committee went to work, but there was a snag. This group was set up with the intention that responsibilities could eventually be transferred to local governments. And as a wiser man once said, nothing is as permanent as a temporary government program. First off, it was not specified when this transfer of responsibilities would occur. Second, during the committee's inquisition, conducted throughout the 1830s and 40s, evidence of reversed engineered technology had been discovered in both commercial and government products alike, making it a legal minefield to impound or regulate. When the inspectors probed suspects about the technology's origins, the answer given would be some guy. And it was apparent various parties were making bank selling patents registered under false names. One organization using and submitting such patents was the Babylon Project, which we discussed in our previous lectures. It also included a list of technologies that had made some people a lot of money. And not to mention the common items like wavecasters that could no longer be phased out of everyday life. So, when the committee would find a suspect, government institutions started dragging their feet. Then came the complaints from companies accusing Lazare and his committee of harassment, nor did these parties shy away from slander campaigns against Lazare's character, calling him an Austrian pawn, or worse. Thus the battle for legitimacy began that would drag on for decades, which, quite frankly, the Swiss government had little incentive to pursue. Lazar, once a renowned diplomat, was now considered a pariah, hell-bent on creating international scandals that would shatter the concert of Europe. Even Metternich himself began to regret his decision to support the project. At the midpoint of the century, this was going to change. By 1849, little had been achieved. Lazar, now in his twilight years, was losing credibility with the passing of every fruitless case against the companies suspected of reverse engineering. At wit's end, he needed an irrefutable case, something that rattled the great powers to such a degree they had no choice but to prosecute. And to his surprise, it would land in his very lap. That year, Lazar received a letter signed by a person only known to history as Pendleton. This letter claimed a reverse engineering program and other sketchy goings-on were occurring in one of the French territories overseas. French Guiana, Siam, was designated a prison colony in 1815. It was one of those places so deadly to European settlers, France was sending its prison population there to expand the settlement and build its economy. The Pendleton letter revealed that the Empire started using that prison for other ends. The Recovery Committee was skeptical, but then France refused to offer visas to its inspectors over safety concerns. This was not entirely unjustified. Apart from the scum sent there, the city was, unsurprisingly, rife with organized crime, racial tensions between the Asian workers, called coolies, runaway maroon slaves, and the native Karina tribes. Yeah, the place was a powder keg. Suffice to say, it was an unpopular tourist destination, meaning the colonists could pretty much get away with anything that they wanted. But we'll discuss Siam's history in full detail in our next video, because there is so much to talk about. This lack of cooperation would not deter the Recovery Committee. Lazar knew this was his last chance to redeem his organization's credibility, thus he personally ordered the conception of Operation Magellan. It would be the most clandestine investigation the Recovery Committee would perform, thus at this point it didn't matter anymore. Disguised as sailors, several inspectors would infiltrate the colony's settlement. From there they worked their way into the city's underworld, and what they found there? Well, the reports have never been disclosed to the public. We do know that Siam became the place to go for reverse-engineered technology, be it blueprints or real-life inventions. There is speculation that these agents even compiled a list of businesses, NGOs, entrepreneurs, and even generals who had done dealings with Siam's less savory elements. But these Siam papers have never been released or confirmed to exist. What is known is that the inspectors managed to join a ferry bound for Devil's Island as deckhands, and what they found there shocked them. An entire battalion equipped with never-before-seen weapon systems that people only knew from futuristic novels. And there was more. Much more. But that is outside the scope of this lecture. But no worries. We'll get to it soon enough. With the discovery of the penal legions in Guinea, the French Empire had a lot of explaining to do. The other great powers acknowledged that regulation was a necessity for the sake of peace, and absolutely not because of the international court's interference would endanger their own interests. Perish the thought. But as bureaucrats and politicians argued about sanctioning the French for this breach of trust, the concert system would be challenged once again. In 1850, the Castile Rift was discovered, spawning the biggest cow the world had ever seen. After the threat had been dealt with, the Spanish army shared their conclusion. Would this happen again, they would not have the weapon systems to take down such creatures without a large cost in infrastructure and human life. But Lazar knew such military force did exist, and so He did something daring that would change everything. The problem of being connected to alien and futuristic worlds is that you can't count on conventional armies to retaliate against threats that are either non-human or technologically superior. Therefore, Lazar's Recovery Committee would propose two initiatives. The first was the creation of a well-trained, superiorly equipped intervention force, elite troops that would be deployed at short notice using technologies far ahead of their age, not just to fight aliens or human outsiders, but also to combat their collaborators. This would become Project Bellerophon, better known as the Airborne Dragoons. AKA the boys who during the middle of the night go in, deal with the problem and leave before anyone realizes what had happened. The other proposal, however, was to repurpose the French penal legions as an international legion, using convicts as expendable fodder against the unknown. With the Penal Legion being the only force in existence with sufficient firepower, a deal was made that France would be forgiven for its break of protocol and be saved of public embarrassment if they would mobilize the Penal Legion for the common good. The alternative would have been to surrender all their technology they hoarded for research purposes and make the schematics public. Left with no choice, France agreed, and Lazar's committee would be its commander-in-chief, although the Penal Legions remained officially part of the French Imperial Army. As the scope of the Recovery Committee's task was escalated, it got renamed to the International Regulatory Board of Rift-related Activity. Even their new regulators got more policing authority. And that brings us to the 1870s. RA now has its operational headquarters in The Hague, where it coordinates its regulators who inspect companies and suspicious activities. Because they work internationally, their policing abilities are still rather limited. Despite The Hague Convention's outlawing reverse engineering, every nation has its own regulations regarding Rift-related transgressions. RA regulators depend on the assistance of local police forces to conduct arrests, interventions, etc. However, it found its ways to apply direct action more effectively, although some might question its legality. After all, this organization was established to solve one problem. Then it was made responsible for a multitude of issues across multiple disciplines and borders without a vision, established line of command, defined jurisdiction, or the authority to enforce ad hoc policy. So, if you meet one, toss a coin to your regulator. The Rift business is an interesting venture, rife with entrepreneurial spirits, romantic explorers, secret organizations and covert government agencies, each using the Rift's bounties in their own way. While diplomats worry about our precious status quo, other factions saw the Rifts as an existential threat. Instead of reaping the benefits, these groups sought to contain or even destroy the Rifts. Among them, Ra found some allies who were not concerned with diplomacy or the rule of law, but we'll discuss them some other time. Ra became like a spider in a web, relentlessly weaving and rewiring its networks to ever-changing circumstances. Bringing the Penal Legions under their control was but the first step in their mission to stem the tide of Rift-related activities, but as the threats revealed themselves, it became obvious to the regulators that giving out fines wouldn't cut it. To illustrate what they were dealing with, our next lecture will detail the Devil's Island affair, a tie-in to our upcoming book, The Casket Girls, the first book in a series about mechs, maidens and monsters, now on Kickstarter, written by Bonsard Bokel and illustrated by Johan Alexander. But you have to hurry as the campaign closes in a couple of days. Also, we're working on a steampunk RPG. Just throwing that out there. So please tell your friends and help us make this a grand success so we can keep paying our artists to illustrate these videos. And with that, class dismissed.